Hey everybody, this is Dave-Inder Comar, and today's video is about acknowledging the era of crisis that we're living in. I believe that the only way for us to build a better world together, for us to first acknowledge the problems that exist. As I'm going through life and as I'm living through life, I just see that there's a denial in place about the scope of the problems that we face this century as a species, and the problems that we're leaving for future generations to come as well. What do I mean when I talk about the crisis? Well, I'm talking about a variety of overlapping problems that we face as a species, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and planetary destruction, as well as the seeming inability of our governments to confront these crises. There's also a related crisis of human rights and democracy that we're all experiencing and living through in many parts of the world. These crises are intersectional, meaning that as some of them get worse, they're going to interplay with one another and cascade with one another. Let me give you a very interesting example that a lot of people are starting to work on, which is this concept of climate migration. As climate change impacts worsen, they're going to make it more difficult for us to lead our lives. These impacts are also going to be felt in a disproportionate way, with vulnerable communities, historically excluded communities, bearing the brunt of these impacts. Over the coming years and decades, there's anticipated to be an increase in human migration as people leave heavily impacted areas to richer areas of the world. This migration, in turn, will interplay with domestic crises that perhaps richer countries are going through themselves. That migration will interact with ongoing environmental pressures and environmental crises also in the works. Climate migration is itself a consequence and a response to climate change, but that will in turn create social issues, legal issues, international relations issues. Another largely unexplored issue when we're talking about intersecting and cascading challenges this century is the breakdown of democracy and human rights in response to climate change impacts. I think there's a grave risk that as climate change impacts worsen, democratic conditions in countries are going to wither and come under attack in response to governments being ineffective or not knowing what to do. Those kind of pressures are a fertile soil for demagogues who will label enemies or blame certain groups of people for the kinds of challenges that societies are facing. I think that as global temperatures increase and as climate change impacts worsen, you're likely to see an increase in those kinds of domestic pressures. And I think there's real questions as to human rights, as we conceive of them today, are capable of being protected in that kind of environment. Let's talk about how governments and socioeconomic systems are struggling to acknowledge the crisis, how these systems are in a kind of denial. I think one of the best examples of this kind of denial is actually the climate crisis. Climate change is not a new issue. Climate change has been something that governments have been formally discussing with each other for 30 years. And we've had sufficient science in that period to understand that climate change is being produced by the burning of fossil fuels. 30 years ago, a transition off of fossil fuels would have been a much gentler process. Now we're looking at this incredibly challenging transition that we have to make if we want to maintain a planet that has conditions that are supportive of human life and civilization. Speaking as a US American living in the United States, the political dialogue has not grasped the urgency of the problem. In fact, the political conversation has repeatedly punted the issue for other people to solve or for future generations to solve. The refusal 30 years ago to deal with this problem has created a much bigger problem today. And similarly, our refusal today to deal with the reality of the situation is going to create a nightmare 20 to 30 years from now. There's a failure of government to imagine a better world and to work for that better world. There's been a failure of government to outline this transition off of fossil fuels and how that transition can happen in a just and equitable way. So then it falls to us. It falls to us as people and as citizens to acknowledge the scale of the crisis, and then for us to use democratic processes to implement those changes that we need. When people talk about what's the most important thing to do to start working on resolving these planetary challenges, I say the first thing we need to be doing is acknowledging the scale of the problem. That sounds easy, but it actually isn't, because this crisis is actually so giant that to acknowledge the scale and scope of the problem is overwhelming. We all have in our heads a vision of what we think the future is going to look like. I mean, that's what gets us out of bed in the morning. And that vision of the future, unfortunately, is probably a fantasy. That vision of the future probably assumes a stable climate system that we just don't have anymore. That vision of the future assumes that there are solutions in place to the impacts that are coming, and that just isn't true either. Personally, for me, when I started to understand the scale and scope of the problem, it was incredibly overwhelming. What's helped me is this next part of the video where I'm going to talk about why acknowledging the problem actually creates the foundation for building a better world. This is an unusual way to think about the planetary crises that we face today, but I think they can also be seen as an opportunity for our species to evolve in such a way where we can build a better world collectively. Even if the climate weren't changing, our world today would still be filled with various forms of injustice. And in a lot of ways, working for the resolution of these planetary crises, including climate change, is an opportunity for us to lay the foundation for how we can live in a better way. There's a remarkable beauty that exists in our universe, in the world. There's a remarkable beauty in nature. There's a remarkable beauty that exists in the human experience in terms of our ability and our capacity for love, in our ability to create meaningful human relationships, in living lives filled with dignity. There's also a beauty that comes from exploring and implementing our human agency, our ability to impact the world in a positive way. That beauty that exists in our capacity to comprehend and experience that beauty, that can act as a compass away from the crisis and towards solutions. If you're watching this or if you've been drawn to this information because you have an instinct that something is wrong in our world today, I want to let you know that there's actually a bit of a jump you have to make to acknowledge the current state of things, because it is a big challenge that we're facing. As I'm making this video, the United Nations Environment Program predicts up to 2.8 degrees of warming this century based on current government policies. We also know that after 1.5 degrees of global warming, there is an enhanced risk of triggering certain climate change tipping points that could make warming even more dangerous and more difficult for us to deal with as a species. 1.5 degrees is imminent. So there's a short time scale that we're also talking about. We need to acknowledge the problem, and then we need to work with others collectively who have also acknowledged the problem. From there, we can start to work on collective action to protect our human rights and to protect the planet for ourselves and for future generations to come. Here's my call to action to you, is to start to acknowledge, really acknowledge some of the crisis points that our planet faces today, that we face today collectively as a species. And to start thinking about what a better world would look like and maybe what your role could be in building that better world. I also invite you to share your thoughts in the comments and to like the video if you've enjoyed it, and to subscribe for more content like this about how we can start to build a better world together. Thanks again for your attention, and I'll have more soon.